Hey everybody, how you doing? Woo, man, it's cold here today. It is cold. This is Michigan. This is why I think this is it for me in Michigan. I can't take it. Alright, welcome to my first video that I'm actually recording in the year 2025. I tried to do this a few hours ago and I got so tired, I don't know what happened to me. I think it was like a drop in blood sugar or something. I laid down, I took a nap, I'm ready to go now. Had a nice hot cup of coffee. I think it's the cold. You know, I could have went out and did some Ubering this morning and I just didn't want to do it. Anyway, what are we doing today? What are we doing today? I'm going to endeavor, starting from now, I'm not counting the intro, beginning to the end of the Beatles, really more about the end. And we're gonna talk about the entire career kind of, but we're gonna center on the breakup. But one of the questions we're asking is, does Yoko get too much of a pass? Is she as innocent as some say, or is she as guilty as some say? Let's talk about it. Let's start really quick. We're just in 3 sections, guys. The first section is the beginning, the inception, and the coming together of John and Paul. Very quickly, we know a lot of the details, a lot of the information I'm getting right now. I got inspired to do this by a book called All You Need Is Love. I'm going to post a picture of that over here somewhere. And great book. It's interviews with a lot of the people that were around the Beatles at the time, and kind of get the bird's eye view. Peter Brown, Steve Gaines, who were very much so around at that time. Well, at least Peter Brown was. They were interviewing all those folks that were around them. It's a whole host of people. Patty Boyd, Derek Taylor, and the list goes on. The Beatles were John's band. That's how it started. They were John's band, and John was the one who invited Paul. John invited Paul.
Because in the history of the Beatles, Paul met me the first day I did Bebop-A-Lula live on stage. Okay? And a mutual friend brought him to see my group called the Quarrymen. And we met and we talked after the show, and I saw he had talent, and he was playing guitar backstage and doing 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. And I turned around to him right then on first meeting and said, "Do you want to join the group?" And I think he said yes the next day, as I recalled it. Now, George came through Paul, and Ringo came through George, although, of course, I had a say in where they came from, but the person I actually picked as my partner, who I recognized had talent and I could get on with, was Paul.
John invited Paul. Both of these two guys had big egos, but they were really two sides of a coin. John, I think one of his sources of pride was that this was his band. This was his band. John was an artist, a true artist, where Paul was a real, incredibly gifted, talented musician. And I mean musician. He played bass, a great bass player, piano, a little trumpet, I understand, guitar. I mean, there wasn't very much this guy could not play just by picking it up. And of course, drums. We know he played drums. John was not that way. John painted. He wrote poetry. He wrote a book. He acted in How We Won the War. He was the true Renaissance man. And if you don't know what that is, I'll post a definition of Renaissance man so you can see. The case in point about these two guys is the single, or should I say the double A side single of Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields. I want you to see this. I want you to see who they were. They were both geniuses, but they were two sides of the same coin. And Ringo likes to tell the story of how Paul used to, kind of make them work. Him and John would sit around the garden, enjoying the sun, and Paul would get them to go to work.
Well, Paul loved to work more than all of us. because John and I would be like hanging out in the garden and the phone would ring. We knew it was him. Hey lads, should we go into the studio? All right, yeah. So I've always thanked him for being that guy, because otherwise we'd have put like 3 albums out and vanished.
Okay, but you listen to the song Penny Lane, turn that 45 over, listen to Strawberry Fields, and it is so explicit there, folks. Paul McCartney is a genius pop songwriter. He could write a song about a toaster, and you would walk out of this room singing that song about the toaster like it was the best melody you ever heard. Penny Lane is Paul's song, written by Paul, about a street, and you hear about the barbershop and the haircut place, I think, or the bank. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there, the streetcars, where you get a real picture of the street. A real picture. A little bit of Paul's perspective, but mostly it's a picture of the street, Penny Lane, that Paul grew up and knew and loved. Turn that record over and you get Strawberry Fields. Strawberry Fields, I don't come away, when I listen to Strawberry Fields, I don't hear so much the picture of Strawberry Fields. I come away with John having all sorts of fun childhood fantasies in Strawberry Fields, and for him it was freedom, because we know that John was somewhat of an orphan, right? He was raised by his aunt. There was so many struggles. Paul also had some struggles growing up, but people handle things different. John was introspective and internal, and to hide his introvertedness, from what I understand, and you'll see this in that book, All You Need Is Love, he really comes off more like a bully sometimes in the early years. Definite bully, a hard-edged, kind of callous, but that was a way of covering things. And I've read several books on the Beatles, this is just the latest one, and that's been said by more than one author, that John had this tough, rough exterior, where Paul seemed more go with the flow kind of guy, when really that wasn't necessarily true. Paul, behind the scenes, was taking care of business and doing the job of songwriting. That was Paul's job, and he saw it that way. And trust me, this is not a knock on Paul. He was great at it. Like I said, he'll write you a song about the blender, about the toaster, whatever. John wrote Help, crying out for help. John wrote I'm a Loser. John wrote Strawberry Fields Forever, which is a masterpiece. John wrote A Day in the Life, about these tragedies that happen, but what you come across with is this haunting feeling of being lost among these tragedies. Compared with the Paul section of that song, which is about putting the comb in your hair and smoking a joint, right? Very mundane. The middle's very catchy. You know, woke up, get out of bed, and the rest of the song is so haunting and so emotionally big, deep. That's better than big. Deep. Anyway, that's the scene. Then they get famous. We're going to go to part 2. Then they get famous, and the business part kicks in. But neither of these guys were very good at business. All right, welcome to segment 2, I guess. Anyway, the business part. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there are a lot of factors that went into the Beatles' success and their breakup. And the business end adds pressure because neither of these guys, John or Paul, wanted to be businessmen. Neither of these guys were necessarily good businessmen, and we'll see the evidence to that. Although Paul becomes better at it as time went on, because Paul realized he had to do it because no one else was going to do it. Okay, so early on, and we all know, they hire Brian Epstein, who had come from money. His family was wealthy, but they hired him because his car was cool, and he had cool suits. And Paul says that in the book, All You Need Is Love. They didn't hire him because of his resume. So, I mean, these guys, John and Paul were cut from their own cloth. But Brian did not really know how to manage artists. Evident by he ends up hiring Dick James, or not even hire, he goes into a partnership with Dick James as the Beatles publisher. And the deal he cuts for royalties is 50-50. Dick James gets 50% and Lennon McCartney get 50%. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous that the Beatles would get only half of this share, right? Well, that's not the worst of it. Dick James sets up a satellite company in the States to license the music to Capitol Records. It's his company. And that company sends 50% back to Dick James, Lennon McCartney, and Dick James in Britain gets 50%, Lennon McCartney gets 50%, which means Lennon McCartney are only really getting 25% because Dick is still getting the lion's share from the company he set up. So he's paying himself, and then out of that, paying Lennon McCartney. So he's literally working it out so we could give John and Paul as little as he could possibly give them. Meanwhile, we know they were working like crazy at 63, 64, 65. No days off. They were in the studio, cutting records, sometimes 2 records a year, every 6 months putting one out, touring around the world, all sorts of stuff. You're running to Japan, coming back. You're running to the States, coming back. Oh my goodness, all that work and getting very little money for it. And then Brian does one more thing to where he has to apologize to John and Paul. He ends up getting Brian ends up getting some friends of his from the States to set up a merchandising company. They're going to take the Beatles name and put it on lunch boxes and pencils and thermoses and all that stuff and sweatshirts, whatever. And the deal he sets up is 90-10. His friends in the States get 90%, the Beatles get 10%, but that's not the worst of it. Brian's friends in the States start selling licenses to the Beatles' name to everybody. So they start selling their license or renting their license to all these other folks, and the Beatles are getting none of that. All the Beatles are receiving is 10% of the initial deal with those initial friends that Brian made. Brian felt so bad when he found out about this. By the way, later on, those folks that did that renting of the licensing got sued, and John and Paul did recoup some of their money. But Brian felt so bad, and the story's in the book, and it's touching. He goes to John and Paul with his head down, profusely apologizing for what he had done, and that he trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. And John and Paul, again, they didn't really want to be businessmen, John and Paul. They didn't really want to be. They hug him, they tell him it's going to be okay. It's all right, we understand. We're not worried about it. But when you think about it, later on, Apple, the company that John and Paul started, was going broke. And they could have used that income. They could have used that income. So let's fast forward a little bit now to a little more of that tension between John and Paul, which didn't just start when Brian passes away. Although that is exacerbated. Exacerbate? Is that a word? Exasperated. I don't know. I'm so not intelligent. Anyway, Paul had already done something that nobody else in the band had done. Paul had cut Yesterday by himself. He wrote it on his own, only had a little help with lyrics. But he went to George Martin, and George Martin was happy as a clam about this because George, he didn't really want to do comedy albums. That's what he was doing before the Beatles. George gets to orchestrate the strings and to write them out and all that stuff. And that was really what George wanted to do. And then he does it again for Eleanor Rigby. Oh my goodness, he's just doing all this kind of stuff that he loves to do. And Paul and George are forming a bond, a special bond. And John, say what you want, he was a character sometimes, but he never did that. He never recorded a tune without at least one of the other Beatles. Even the Ballad of John and Yoko, he recorded with Paul. Just the two of them. But Paul went in and recorded Yesterday by himself. Eleanor Rigby, pretty much by himself. Mother Nature's Son, by himself. And there were a few other songs where Paul just goes in and does the tune by himself. Plays all the instruments by himself. I mean, they brought in strings and orchestration and all that kind of stuff. And for me, that was Paul, maybe consciously, maybe not. I would say more unconsciously, with all the tensions of the business and the hecticness of the Beatles schedule and the touring. He was saying, I want to step out a little bit from John's shadow. Because like I said, Paul was definitely the more prolific writer, but John was the artist. Paul is a gifted songwriter to the point where he's a savant. John is the Renaissance man. He's the artist. He's the one who writes stuff that stays with you. Case in point, Brian dies. Paul gets an idea for Sgt. Pepper. John doesn't really like the idea all that much. The rest of the Beatles, we'll hear from them. Ringo feels like a session guy. It's his least favorite album. He likes the material, but least favorite album. George hardly shows up. And John will tell you anything that he did on that album could have been done on any album. It had nothing to do with Sgt. Pepper's. But George Martin and Paul were just having a grand old time.
See, I never really liked Sgt. Pepper. I think it's a fine album. All the work we do is fine. But I think I felt like a session man on it. We put so much on it, strings and brass. And you'd sit around the studio for days while they're overdubbing other things. It is a fine album, but just for me. Emotionally, I prefer Abbey Road.
It's called the first concept album. It doesn't go anywhere. Mr. Kite, all my contributions have absolutely nothing to do with this idea of Sgt. Pepper and his band. But it works, because we said it worked, and that's how it appeared.
But despite that it was Paul's idea, despite that Paul had all these visions of the costumes and all that stuff, the best song on that album is A Day in the Life by John. I think Paul understood that John was a gifted writer, that Paul was gifted too, but not in the same way. That when John wrote a tune, it was earth-shattering. When Paul wrote a tune, they were great, they were good, they were cool, but John, most of my favorite Beatles tunes, this is biased, are John tunes. Until you get to the White Album, then we see Paul really start to come out. Even Magical Mystery Tour, which again, Paul's idea, we're going to get the bus, we're going to go out, we're going to do all these filming and all this kind of stuff. The best song, the best two songs on Magical Mystery Tour, Strawberry Fields Forever, and of course, I Am the Walrus. Did Paul write some cool tunes? Yes, he did, but not like those two. And again, not consciously, but underneath, the chasm between the two of these grows. The chasm between John and Paul grows. And then, in walks Yoko. Stay tuned for the final segment. Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome back. It's been a few days. You notice I changed my shirt. I wanted to read and reread the Yoko Ono interview in All You Need Is Love to see if what I read bolstered my opinions about her or countermanded them, counteracted them, I don't know. Changed my mind. Anyway, let's dig right in, guys. Who was Yoko Ono in 1966? Well, she comes back to England from New York with her tail between her legs. New York didn't want her art. She tried to break into the New York art scene, and they didn't want it. So she comes back, broke, and probably somewhat depressed because she wanted to be known. She wanted to be known as that new avant-garde artist that people look at their stuff and go, wow. And New York was the place to do that in. If you could make it in New York, you know the saying. So she comes back to England, broke. Her marriage is failing. That's her second marriage, is failing. And she tries now to make it in the London or the English scene as a young avant-garde artist. Performance art, mainly, and she's trying to do it. And look, I don't know art. I don't know it. I'm not here to judge art. But there are those who do. And at that time, there was a man named Robert Fraser who knew Yoko Ono and he knew of her work. And who is Robert Fraser? Okay, first, he was a big art dealer at that time in London. He also ran a very influential art gallery that if Yoko Ono could be featured there, that would really help her career. But more than that, Robert Fraser art directed the cover for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Maybe the single most known and acclaimed cover in rock history. So his opinion I accept. And of Yoko's work, he said, well, to him she was just another second-hand artist, and he wished that John could see that. By second-hand, as you read on, he's saying that there were no new ideas. There was nothing earth-shattering coming from Yoko. Now, it's possible. There are people in history who nobody cared for their work, and then they died, and we went, oh, wow, it was great. That could have happened with Yoko, but Robert says he didn't see that earth-shattering thing in Yoko. Just average, run-of-the-mill stuff that other people were doing similarly and some doing it better. But I think because, Yoko went to New York, spent a lot of money living there, trying to be accepted, I think what she wanted more than money, what Yoko wanted so much, this is my opinion, was to be known as that new avant-garde artist, that one. She wanted to be talked about. She wanted to be known as one of the enlightened ones. In comes John. We've already stated that John was feeling lost. We're around the Sgt. Pepper time, and he's feeling like the band that he had started is not his band anymore. Whatever the Beatles had become, this is not what he envisioned. He was feeling lost and bewildered. In walks Yoko to his life. I think Yoko knew that if she could partner with John or a Beatle or someone of that stature, I don't think it had to be John, if she could partner with someone of that stature, folks like me who are morons would think that she was something because of the person that liked her stuff. In other words, a lot of folks, including me, thought this, and I bet you did too, if you're my age, thought, wow, I don't get what Yoko's doing. I don't get the screaming. I don't get any of that. But it must be good. It must be saying something that I can't see because John likes it, and John is one of my musical heroes, and to me, a musical genius. So she must have something, and I thought that's what she wanted, if I could get with that person. If I could get with that person. And let's just talk about a few of the falsehoods, because we lie, her falsehoods, we lie about stuff that when we're trying to hide our motivations. And a lie that she likes to tell is that she did not know who the Beatles were when she met John. Well, how do you try to get into the English London art scene and get yourself in with all those young, hip people doing artwork? And the Beatles were part of that scene. They were breaking down mores and smoking pot and doing all that stuff. How do you try to break into that scene and not know who they were? And case in point, and we'll show you when Paul tells you, is to raise money for John Cage's birthday. So they said, John Cage is a 20th century avant-garde composer, by the way. To raise money, she knocks on Paul McCartney's door. Paul McCartney says, not only did she know the Beatles, she knew where they lived.
When you met Yoko, she claimed she didn't know who the Beatles were, but meanwhile, she knew who the Beatles were because
met him.
she met you.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing is, my version is that we were in London and Yoko came round to my house, knocking on the door. Someone said, there's this Japanese lady outside there. So I just said, well, come on in, have a cup of tea, we'll have a talk. She came in and she said, it's John Cage's birthday. And us artists want to collect a bunch of manuscripts to give him for his, whatever it was, 60th or something birthday.
Didn't you, in fact, laugh at her years later when she said, I didn't know who Jean was, I don't know Beatles, I never heard. You knew that was not true.
I don't know, man. I tell you, you know, live and let live.
She knew where they lived. The other falsehood that she tells, I believe, is that she was shy and old-fashioned. Remember, she was still married when she started dating John, so was John still married. And she didn't want to start having an affair with John because she was old-fashioned and all that kind of thing. And she was shy. Well, to me, knocking on Paul McCartney's door to ask for money, that doesn't sound too shy to me. And finally, Cynthia, John's wife. And we all know the story. Cynthia comes home from a holiday and finds John and Yoko in her kitchen, Yoko wearing her bathrobe. Yoko wearing Cynthia's bathrobe. And the story goes, they thought that Cynthia was coming back at a later date and they get caught. All right. You hear someone coming down the hallway or up the stairs, you can't run into the bathroom and change and put on clothes? Cynthia knew that John was dealing with her on a work level. Couldn't do that. Doesn't sound too much like a shy, old-fashioned girl to me. And she goes on about how much she felt bad for Cynthia. And when you read the stories about how she treated Cynthia and Julian, it doesn't make sense.
You settled with Yoko on the estate. You've got X amount of money, but you had to buy the postcards that you'd written to your father, and your father wrote to you at auction. I went,
I know.
That's disgusting.
But it's not only that. It's a lot of his belongings that were auctioned off by Yoko, and a lot of his, whether they were personal possessions or whether they were instruments, And I mean, the most ironic thing is with the settlement that I did receive, is that I've been buying his stuff back, with that. So I'm buying his stuff back with his money, which is absolutely insane.
Finally, as John and her get closer, she starts coming to the studio. And even though they say Linda McCartney was a domineering woman, I really think Linda McCartney was just a strong woman, a very opinionated woman, very independent woman. But there was a boundary. You don't come into the studio, and she starts coming in every day. And then she starts criticizing Paul's tunes and how they could be better. And the only people the Beatles allowed to criticize their songs were the Beatles or George Martin and make them better. Paul did not want to hear from Yoko Ono. No, 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 no. Yoko wanted them to see her and John as the same. Lastly, John is supposed to play with George for the Bangladesh concerts. George tells Alan Klein to tell John he does not want Yoko on stage. Yoko and John don't attend, they don't go. And Yoko says in the interview, Alan Klein didn't realize it wasn't John, that he wasn't representing just John. He was representing John and Yoko. But Alan Klein didn't really want that. He wanted to represent the Beatles. He was a crook, but he wanted to represent the Beatles. So, bottom line, I know this went on long. Bottom line, do I think that Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles? No. But she was gasoline to an already raging fire. With all of these things happening, she wanted John. At first, this is my opinion, not for a man to love, not for a husband, but to help her find her fame. Because let's face it, guys, if it wasn't for John Lennon, we wouldn't know who Yoko Ono was. Alright guys, I know that was a long one. I hope you enjoyed it. Next one, I promise, I'll be back on the kit. It'll be short. I'll have this mic with me. We'll see how we can do. And I figured out something with the lighting that'll be really good, I think, much better than I had been doing. Anyway, love doing this for you. See you on the next one. By the way, put your disagreements or agreements in the comments. See you on the next one.